Okay, let's start. Axiological foundations of an effective social market economy, a model for the free CIS countries. When we discussed the Free CIS initiative, its conditions, the development opportunities for this region of Central Europe, and the goals of joint action by all Free CIS countries, we often forget, or at least downplay, the fundamental reason why we want cooperation between all our countries. This is, of course, the independence and sovereignty of our nations. But what is necessary to realize these great values? It is the prosperity of our societies, which we can achieve only through consistent and rapid economic development. Otherwise, we will lose. In a sense, this was precisely the intention of the founding fathers of the European communities, later transformed into the European Economic Community and the European Union. The goal was peace in Europe after the most tragic and brutal half-century since the dawn of Europe. First, the communization of what is essential for war, energy resources and steel, and then the creation of a single common economic area for shared economic development and the achievement of what German ordoliberals called Wohlstand für alle, prosperity for all. Over the past half-century, post-war Germany has enjoyed the greatest success in rapidly achieving prosperity in Europe. Thanks to sound economic policies and the creation of a social market economy, it achieved unprecedented growth in the first 20 years after the war, that called the German economic miracle. This conservative vision of economic policy is worth emulating. This program was based on the scrupulous implementation by the German government of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and the Minister of Economy Ludwig Erhard of the following principles of the social market economy system. First, a price system of perfect competition that serves as an indicator of the scarcity of production factors and goods. According to ordoliberals, the functioning of perfectly competitive prices is justified by the thesis that economic activity is primarily aimed at solving the problem of scarcity of economic goods. However, prices in their informational function can only accurately reflect the scarcity of goods when they are freely formed in the market under conditions of perfect competition. Second, stabilization of the value of money. Perfect competition alone, however, is not sufficient for prices to fulfill their fundamental purpose. To realize this goal, the state's task is to pursue appropriate monetary policy aimed at stabilizing the value of money. Third, open markets, freedom of economic activity. This means that all economic entities have the opportunity to freely enter and exit a given market. This limits the possibility of monopolies and oligopolies emerging, which under these conditions may be only a temporary phenomenon, as the economy, through the activity of its entities, tends to return to a state of competition. Fourth, private ownership of the means of production. A competitive economic order can only be built on the foundation of private property. Otherwise, competition between state-owned enterprises would be merely a sham and imitation. However, ordoliberals recognize that private property has different meanings and in different circumstances, for example, under the dominance of monopolies and oligopolies, private property does not necessarily play a positive role. Therefore, the thesis that private property benefits both the owner and non-owners holds true only under conditions of a competitive economic order. 5. Freedom of contract. In a competitive economic order, economic entities should be able to enter into contracts at their own discretion, albeit with the framework of applicable law. This is a sine qua non condition of a free market. However, older liberals also emphasize the need for legal safeguards against the abuse of freedom of contract for anti-competitive purposes, limiting or even eliminating competition, which economic entities will always and everywhere strive to achieve. 6. Financial liability of economic entities for damage caused to other entities. According to Walter Eucken, the principle that should apply to financial liability is that whoever makes economic decisions in a company should be responsible for their negative consequences, in accordance with the principle, quotation, whoever benefits should also be responsible for damages, end of quotation. And number 7, consistency of economic policy. In the view of older liberals, the instability of, or even abruptness of economic policy decisions which react to economic events, quotation, on a case-by-case basis, constant changes in tax rates, customs duties, or run interest rates, generates an insufficient propensity for entrepreneurs to invest, resulting in insufficient investment volume to the economy. Therefore, the state should ensure the stabilization of its parameters in its economic policy, thereby reducing the so-called risk premium, the high cost of obtaining revenues and fiscal burdens that entrepreneurs factor into long-term investments. Without having more time to develop the analysis of the individual principles constituting the social market economy, I would like to draw attention primarily to principle number 6, financial liability of economic entities for damages caused to other entities. Whoever benefits should also be responsible for damages. This requirement of the social market economy idea clearly indicates its foundation in full Christian freedom in truth, treated not only as freedom from, expressed in the formula, do whatever you want. Freedom, even in the economic sphere, must be understood holistically. First and foremost, as freedom from all unnecessary restrictions and constraints, including the unjust and unequal treatment of economic entities, but also as the freedom to treat others justly, well, and equally. Consequently, instead of the formula, do whatever you want, the principle, do what you are supposed to, must be applied. The Church teaches this based on the Gospel. The Church Fathers and its great saints taught this. St. John Paul II emphasized, quotation, "We need mature, responsible freedom, not the fiction of freedom. Only truth sets people, entire communities, and nations free." End of quotation. He pointed out that freedom does not mean the right to do what one wants, but the right to do what one should. Following the Church's teaching, teachings and Catholic social teaching, contemporary, eminent lawyers and specialist experts in commercial law have also formulated relevant theses regarding economic freedom. Among them is Marian Zdyb, a professor of law from Lublin, who emphatically expresses his views on this matter. Quotation. The lack of administrative and legal regulation does not mean unfettered freedom, because regardless of legal norms, one must take into account moral norms, specific manifestations of a particular philosophy of public order. End of quotation. The lack of this reference can lead to, quotation, the formation of homo economicus, to the materialization of the idea of freedom and all actions as well as evaluations. End of quotations. In such conditions, economic freedom may grow into a means enabling the only optimal expression of materialism in the economic sphere. All this threatens to transform the philosophy of economic freedom, quotation, into slavery of one's own pleasures and styles, the glorification of enterprises in spheres that give rise to pathological phenomena, the pornography industry, drug trafficking, unfettered trade in means of killing. If economic freedom were to also mean the freedom to engage in wicked, immoral or criminal activities, then I would have to be against it. This would be a step towards the death of European civilization, rooted in its Christian roots and Roman legal tradition. These were the factors that determined Europe's greatness, not the tradition of Siberian labor camps, drug mafias, the culture of death, and all sorts of revolutionary myths, even if the adjective progressive is added to them. And other representative of conservative economic thought, Professor Novak, said, quotation, "The Statue of Liberty given to the United States by France over 100 years ago is a symbol of true freedom. A woman, not a warrior, holds the torch of enlightenment against darkness in one hand and the tablet of rights in other. This lady undoubtedly resolved, disciplined, and with a serious face, is the proper symbol of freedom. Certainly not a neon light pornographic shop in Manhattan. If symbols of moral decadence became symbols of liberal societies, freedom would perish within a single generation. One doesn't have to be a Puritan to recognize that freedom is primarily a property of the spirit, the intellect, the light based on the understanding of law. Unfortunately, in many countries and even in the very heart of European Union, this understanding of freedom and economic liberty is practically non-existent. The Free Seas Initiative, as an alternative form of cooperation among European Union member states, must return to responsible economic development to gradually, consistently and rapidly increase its influence on the course of events in Europe for the freedom, independence and sovereignty of all Central European states. This can only happen if we base our economic cooperation on universal axiological foundations. Thank you for your attention.